Forum on Forum Friday. Welcome to Forum Friday, where we talk about topics that are being discussed in the forum, try and answer your questions, and get the discussion going. Please smash that subscribe button, and then you won't ever miss a broadcast from Bakerpedia, and you'll be one of the cool kids who is always in the know. So we got a couple things happening in the forum this week. Let me just bring my notes up here. One of them is a continued conversation on ascorbic acid. Dr. Lynn and I talked about this briefly previously. And ascorbic acid is not generally used for shelf life, but is primarily used for oxidation in the dough. It has a strengthening effect on gluten proteins because it creates this strengthening of the disulfide bonds in the protein. There's also some thoughts that it helps it unfold or things like that, but that's more datums. Generally the amount used under GMPs in the United States is the recommended maximum is 200 parts per million. Most of the time, what we see, depending on flour quality, is usually around 90 parts per million, or in the 50 to 70 range. Now, this is pretty low. And so further to that conversation was also a question about, well, can I use orange juice to replace ascorbic acid? Well, ascorbic acid is not citric acid. Ascorbic acid is vitamin C. It is in orange juice. It is contained in orange juice, but typically it's only about 30 to 35 milligrams per liter of orange juice. That would mean on a 50 kilo bag of flour, to get 90 parts per million of ascorbic acid, you would have to add about 130 liters of orange juice. That will not make a very good bread dough. So the answer there is actually no. So roughly, if we stick with 90 parts per million, 90 parts per million on a 50 kilo bag of flour would be about 4.5 grams. Now that would be pure ascorbic acid. It's usually not sold in that form, at least not within the baking industry. In the baking industry, it's usually sold in a 10% diluted form. In other words, you would use 10 times as much. You would use 45 grams of diluted ascorbic acid, that is a 10% concentration, on a 50 kilo bag of flour. Still a pretty small amount, so you can see you need to really blend that in well to get good distribution. But it is highly effective at strengthening the disulfide bonds. It will give you a little bit better low volume, better fermentation principally. It produces more oxygen. It helps capture more of the CO2 bubbles. And with that, you can see when you have an overdose of CO2, ascorbic acid in your breads, you will see these lots of little white bubbles on the crust. Or if you see it in donuts, we see this a lot in yeast donuts where too much ascorbic has been dosed. So that's one of the conversations going on about ascorbic acid. One of the other conversations we have is dissolving datum in cold water. So inquiring whether it can be dissolved in cold water. Generally speaking, yes, you need some shear to do this. Because datums it's very popular in the baking industry in enhancing low volume. Datum is diacetyl acid esters of tartaric. Now I have to go to my notes. And this is always a tongue twister, this one. And I had it right here. Here we go. It is diacetyl tartaric acid esters of mono and diglycerides. And we have more information on that on the ingredients page as well on Bakerpedia. And so datums are derived from a plant source, so they are fat containing. So that's why you need some shear. When you initially add it into the cold water, it may just kind of float on top, but if you apply some shear, it will mix in. It's a great emulsifier. It helps, again, with low volume considerably. It's used a lot in hamburger buns and white bread and things like that. And it is also used a lot in dairy creamers because it is a cold emulsifier and works very well. And hence that's why I'm quite sure you should be able to mix that with cold water. And another interesting topic we have in a different category is we have Rafna is looking for ways to stabilize a mung bean feeling for a long time. Not quite sure what is meant by stabilize. Generally, that usually means that if it's not stable, that it's separating, that you're getting syneresis and water is separating out. That might be an indicator that either you need an emulsifier or you need starches that are better binding properties that won't start to allow syneresis to take place. Mung bean has a lot of starch on its own, but perhaps you need some cassava in there or something like that. Or you need an emulsifier like datums, or even sometimes lecithin will help with some of that. If other stability means shelf life as far as molding, that becomes a much more difficult challenge. There it may be preservatives, a combination of preservatives and the types of sugars that you're using to lower your water activity as much as possible, and see if you can replace the moisture primarily with like fructose syrups and or glycerin to maintain the softness without the water activity, and get your water activity down to 0.65 or below. That will help you mitigate potential mold growth, right? And one other question is what sort of seems to come up every now and then is dry yeast. Understanding that there's a difference in the percentages of humidity. And here, person is asking about the difference between active and dry yeast, if it can be blended with the rest of the ingredients without rehydrating. Instant yeast can. Instant yeast is a different type of bacteria strain than is used in active yeast. It is much finer, much smaller in particle size, and it will hydrate very readily. It does not like to be shocked with cold water. It usually shocking using very cold water with instant yeast will provide an extreme retardation of the dough. It can sometimes even damage the bacteria. But active yeast needs to be activated. The main reason for this is that the active yeast is much larger pearls, and they are coated with starch that needs to be dissolved first to release the bacteria and allow the fermentation to begin. For homemakers' use, this is often like sprinkle it over a dish with warm water and sugar in it and wait for it to bubble. The bubble is just an assurance that it is completely dissolved and has started to activate. But if you were to simply dissolve the active yeast in your water solution like we would traditionally do with fresh yeast, then you will be fine as well. You don't necessarily need to wait for it to completely bubble. It's preferable to just as an surety that it is completely dissolved and working, but you do want to dissolve it first. The mixing time in bread doughs is not long enough for the active dry yeast to be able to dissolve the shell and become active then in the bread dough. If you were purposefully intending to retard the dough over several days and remix it, it might work, but I've never tried this. That's just the hypothetical theory. It takes a long time for it to dissolve because the starch doesn't absorb water; it goes into solution. So that is basically what you're trying to do with blending of active yeast and water first. Right? And then one more question we have here is about cassava flour. So I invite everybody to contribute to the conversation here. And this is an interesting challenge. And I hope I'm pronouncing this right. It's Abimco. Is I believe from Nigeria, was it? Yes, from Nigeria. And as a result of one of these other COVID-19 effects, it's affecting commodities and the transport of commodities and harvesting and etc. So Abimco was asking about how they can use tapioca flour or cassava flour effectively in bread production without affecting the quality. And so further, it is, the Abimco is his handle, the person's name is Ayotunde. And so Ayotunde is saying basically that the cost of wheat flour and sugar in Nigeria is increasing so much as a result of this COVID-19 and crop issues and everything, that they're trying to look for ways to manage the cost of their bread and looking to hopefully use cassava flour. I would say that if you replace 5 to 10% of your wheat flour with cassava, you will see minimal impact. There will still be an impact, but it will be less so than if you go higher. The higher you go, the more you will need to replace the gluten with gluten or something that functions like gluten. So it's not an easy answer. From what I know, if others have ideas out there that might help with other ingredients and emulsifiers where tapioca flour can be used as an extender, it would be great to hear that. Would like to invite everyone to participate in the conversation. And so that's all I have for Forum Friday today for you. As always, please share in the conversation. We all love to learn from each other. And introduce yourself in the forum, and please post your questions, and we try to get you responses and encourage others to respond as quickly as possible. Oh, one more other thing I wanted to mention is Ziwa did confirm for us that the differences in enzymes, that multigenic enzymes will perish in the baking temperatures, but if it's amylase enzymes, they could likely survive at or about 190 degrees Fahrenheit in the baking cycle. So the alpha amylase enzyme may help with a shelf life that way. So thank you again, Ziva, for your valuable contributions as always. And everybody is valuable. I appreciate everyone's contribution. And so as your community forum manager, I say have a great weekend, and we'll talk to you again next Friday. Don't forget to subscribe.